Okay, well, hello everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. On behalf of RIKK, Institute for Gender Equality and Difference at the University of Iceland, I want to welcome you to the second lecture of the Fall 2023 series on decolonization. Today's lecture is titled Reproduction of Colonial Discourses in Institutional Practices, Exploring Services and Support for Immigrant Women in Iceland. My name is Geeti Chandra, and I'm research specialist at the guest program here at the University of Iceland, and I will be moderating today's session. Flora Tietgen is a doctoral student at the Faculty for Education and Diversity at the University of Iceland. She's part of a research project on experiences of violence of immigrant women in Iceland, and her research focus is on experiences of intimate partner violence. Flora's research interests include gender-based violence, immigrant experiences, structural violence, and critical theory. In her lecture, Flora draws on postcolonial theories in her analysis of services provided to immigrant women who have experienced violence. So your lecture will be about 40 minutes or so, 35, 40, and then we will have time for questions and discussion. Flora.
Hello. Can you all hear me nice?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Geeti, for this nice introduction. I am very excited to talk to you all today. I would like to start with a bit of context for this lecture and jump right in with the 2018 Me Too movement, which in Iceland revealed several underlying factors, including gender, race, ethnicity, class, and immigrant status that intersect with the experiences of IPV, intimate partner violence. The Me Too stories published by immigrant women further indicate that they do not receive appropriate services and support when experiencing IPV. But who are immigrant women in Iceland? Immigrant women are a heterogeneous group coming from many different places with many different backgrounds and make about 8% of the population in Iceland. In total, immigrants with 163 different citizenships currently live in Iceland, and immigration to Iceland has been increasing rapidly in the past 20 years, as you can see in this chart. The Me Too stories originated a closed Facebook group by and for immigrant women and were published in Haldinn and are therefore publicly available. I would like to talk about a few examples from the stories on how immigrant women describe their experiences with institutions. The woman from story 18 expresses how she struggles to trust the police and lives in the countryside without a shelter being close, so she doesn't know how to get out of the violent relationship she's in. Trust in institution is an issue that also other research about immigrant women's support seeking shows. The lack of trust bases on experiences from home countries, but also on experiences of institutional discrimination and racism that the immigrant woman herself experienced or heard about from other immigrants. There are indications for this behavior among institutions in Iceland and other stories, like, for example, the woman from story 8 shares how during the custody proceedings at the district commissioner, she felt like the commissioner took her ex-partner's, who was Icelandic, side and had no interest in hearing her side of the story. She felt discriminated against due to her being foreign. The woman from story 23 tells how her friend went to the police to report physical and psychological abuse through her partner and shares. She reported the police and they did nothing and did not even offer her a translator. The woman from story 1 tells how the police said that her family lives like wild animals and how when she went to an interview with the Child Protection Services, she was told that she has to go to the doctor or the police to report the violence and that they won't help her unless she does that. She shares, and I quote, "Questions are always like I'm not doing right. I don't want the police saying I'm a wild animal and child protection who say I'm wrong. I want help for all of us can be happy and safe in the home." This indicates that immigrant women are given more of a one-size-fits-all option when asking for help based on the Icelandic culture's understanding of what a woman should do when she experiences IPV. The importance of good services and sensitivity to the immigrant women's needs is emphasized by other research and can be seen in what the woman from story 22 shares. Me personally, the women's shelter is the one home that I know where there's always someone ready to give you the warm hug and a hand to hold onto when the world is breaking in front of you. This quote emphasizes how important support services are for women who experience IPV, particularly immigrant women who often don't have their family living close or don't have a network that could support them, which is something that research in other country contexts emphasizes, and it can also be seen in the Me Too stories. The stories share some more positive experiences with non-governmental institutions, but not with governmental institutions. Besides the Me Too stories, human rights reports suggest that IPV amongst immigrant women in Iceland is considerably more acute than for non-immigrant women, and according to numbers from the police and the women's shelter, numbers of immigrant women seeking support due to IPV are disproportionately high compared to the population of immigrant women in Iceland. All this indicates that immigrant women occupy a precarious position depending on their intersecting identities within political and social structures and often find themselves in a vulnerable position. Here I really want to emphasize that I understand vulnerability as something that is not inherent in the immigrant woman, but is created due to her intersecting positions within a system that oppresses and marginalizes those positions. This precarious position comes as a surprise in the feminist paradise of Iceland, or how a newspaper some time ago titled, "The Best Place to be a Woman." The questions that this raises is who this paradise is for, and for which women it is the best place, as the stories suggest that it does not seem to be the best place for immigrant women. Inspired by all this, a research project on immigrant women's experiences of IPV and also employment-based violence was created, in the context of which, as Giti already mentioned, I focus on the intimate partner violence and experiences with support services and institutions. Me and Thelma, a colleague of mine from said project, conducted 16 interviews with services and institutions between May 2020 and April 2021. We interviewed representatives of governmental and non-governmental institutions who provide services for immigrant women who experienced IPV or interact with women who have experienced IPV. The governmental institutions included the Child Protective Services, the Directorate of Immigration, Social Services, the hospital, and the police. The non-governmental sphere includes institutions which provide services for immigrant women who experience violence in their intimate relationship. We interviewed representatives of those institutions not only in the capital area of Iceland, but also in other parts of the country. The interviews were semi-structured and included questions around their work and services they provide, their experiences with immigrant women seeking support, as well as about staff training. The analysis of the interviews is what I want to talk to you all about today. The goal of the analysis is to find out how institutions construct immigrant women who experience IPV and their needs. The call for this lecture series stated, and I quote, "Decolonization and post-colonial studies show how the lingering effects of colonialism continue to promote silencing and distortion, perpetuate social inequality, weaken democracy, and reduce equality." The focus of my lecture is on the perpetuation of this social inequality through the lingering effects of colonialism for immigrant women who experience IPV. Therefore, I decided to approach my data through the concept of Nordic exceptionalism, which describes the self-image of the Icelandic public and the government that the Icelandic national identity has not been shaped by colonialism and structures of white supremacy, which means it's free from discriminatory practices in that area. This is due to having been a Danish colony and Iceland not having had any colonies itself. Other research argues that if you look at Icelandic history, Icelanders always wanted to be seen as part of the civilized Europeans and as white instead of the uncivilized other. This way of acting can be called colonial complicity. This means that countries on the margins of the center of colonial history, like Iceland, aimed to be closer to this center by becoming complicit in reproducing colonial power relations. This was done in order to profit from being attached to the ones in power and therefore be more powerful themselves. A particular emphasis in the exceptionalism discourse in Iceland is gender equality, which is seen as an important part of Icelandic culture. Furthermore, equality is seen as the basis of the Nordic welfare states, which creates an avoidance of how colonial history impacted the building of those welfare states. Other research in Nordic countries show that gender equality is seen as an indicator for belonging to and exclusion from the nation. Those who are assumed to be different, like for example immigrant women, but also other minoritized groups, are often seen as a threat to the predefined normal. And the normal in Iceland is strongly related to whiteness and to the power to define who is seen as white and who is not. I see whiteness as a constructed category, which is an expression of a historical position of power and not limited to skin color. I understand whiteness in 3 dimensions. A location of structural advantage, which means that the position of a white person has privilege due to how structures in Iceland are built. Second, a standpoint, which means a place from which white people look at themselves, at others, and at the society. And thirdly, it's a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed, as they don't get reflected, as they are seen as the norm. I'm gonna have some water. Because now, to my analysis, where the first theme I would like to talk about is called "They Don't Trust Us." Because something that came up in all the interviews is the lack of trust immigrant women have towards the institutions. Interviewees expressed that this is a big challenge when working with immigrant women. Maria said during the interview, "The foreigners are more afraid of us, and we can feel that the Icelandic family is not as much. It's sad that people are afraid, not just willing to get the help we want to offer." And similarly, Sarah pointed out in her interview, I think the main issue is here that there has to be this trust. They see several reasons that impact the women's trust towards institutions. It's the lack of knowledge about the laws and the processes in Iceland, previous experiences or knowledge about institutions from their countries of origin, misconceptions in the immigrant community, and the main reason they see is the violent Icelandic partner. The lack of knowledge about their rights and institutional processes, like for example custody, is another issue that interviewees discussed as leading to distrust. They argue that the women don't know what their rights are and that the legal situation in Iceland actually provides them with tools to receive a permit to stay in Iceland even though they divorce their partner, or that they are legally supported to continue to have custody over their children after the divorce. There's an emphasis in the interviews that legally the immigrant women are in a good position to get what they need if they just know what their rights are. Concerning previous experiences or knowledge about institutions from the women's countries of origin, the interviewees pointed out how institutions, like for example the police, is often corrupt in the countries of origin of the immigrant women, which leads to the women not trusting the police in Iceland either. The interviewee further says how there are all those myths about the police, and that this leads to immigrant women not going to the police to report their violent partner. The interviewee therefore believes that the police in Iceland is not corrupt and that what she calls myths are just myths that the immigrant women learned from their home countries or the immigrant community in Iceland. Those myths that I just mentioned and also misconceptions, how another interviewee termed it, within the immigrant community about institutions and how trustworthy they are is also something that was brought up during the interviews regularly. I'm adding quotation marks to the word as I believe that based on the Me Too stories, it is debatable whether what the interviewees term as misconceptions or myths are truly always that. But nevertheless, they speak about this as a reason for the women not to trust institutions. The main reason, though, they discuss during the interviews for the lack of trust towards them is the violent Icelandic partner. The violent Icelandic partner is in a powerful position, as many immigrant women come to Iceland because of that partner, which means that they are dependent on them due to their permit, language, administrative processes, and to be introduced to the way things work in Iceland. Or how Katrin puts it, their heads have been filled with crap, and I'm trying to, tell them that's not the way it is. According to the interviews, this is a big part of the service provision of non-governmental but also governmental institutions to help the women understand that what they learned from their violent Icelandic partners is not true. Iris said during the interview, "We think it's another type of abuse, that they've been suffering. We think it's just what their husbands have been telling them. If you get a divorce, you will be kicked out, you will lose your children, and stuff like that." Several other interviewees emphasized the powerful position the Icelandic partner has and how often custody and issues around residency and permits in Iceland are used to pressure immigrant women into staying in the violent relationship. This is something that immigrant women share in their Me Too stories as well. The institutions, therefore, are really invested in telling, teaching, and educating the women about how things really are in Iceland and how institutions in Iceland are trustworthy. Bryndís puts it this way: "I think this is a very important thing to keep in mind, that the women, they don't know Icelandic society, they don't know their rights, they don't know the law environment, and they are being told all sorts of lies and all sorts of untruths. So a lot of our time is spent at trying to explain to them what the real situation is and what is realistic for them to expect. And often I feel that they hesitate to believe us." She explains how when she teaches them what she calls the real situation, it will help them to trust the institutions and reach out to them for support. All these points that the interviewees made can be found in research in other country contexts as well as barriers for immigrant women to not reach out to institutions when they experience IPV due to a lack of trust. Those points are quite individualized, and in the sense that they focus on the immigrant women needing to learn to trust institutions by knowing their rights, learning that many of the myths are indeed myths, and understanding that their violent partner has been telling them lies as a part of their abusive behavior. Besides these individual factors, research also emphasizes that it is crucial to look at structural factors besides the individual factors that are barriers to immigrant women's support seeking. With structural factors, I'm referring to structural and institutional discrimination and racism, as it is important to understand IPV against immigrant women in the context of white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, and economic exploitation of marginalized communities. Barriers like this are hardly mentioned in my interviews, so there's a silence around that, and to me the silence feels really loud. Bryndís, who I just quoted on her teaching immigrant women about the real situation, later in the interview shared a story of one of her clients who was an immigrant woman. She told me how this woman was in a custody dispute with her Icelandic violent ex-partner at the Sýslumaðurinn, the district commissioner, and felt like she was not listened to or believed. Bryndís inquired about her case and was told that the woman is not telling the truth and that they know because the Icelandic ex-partner told them that she's lying. By telling this story, Bryndís actually shares about institutional discrimination and violence that this immigrant woman experienced. She goes on telling two similar stories of her clients of hers and concludes, I think prejudice is definitely present, and how she thinks that there needs to be more awareness around cultural differences. What I find interesting about this is that Bryndís doesn't seem to connect the lack of trust of immigrant women towards institutions and her having to teach them how the institutions are trustworthy. She doesn't compare them to these stories. Sorry, I lost it. That she told me that where institutions actually proved that they are not trustworthy for immigrant women. This interview was the only one where institutional discrimination came up. It remained a silence in all other interviews and was not used to explain why immigrant women have a lack of trust towards them. More water. So after exploring this theme, I decided to look at who it actually is that the immigrant woman should trust. Who is the us in they don't trust us? And how do the institutions prepare themselves to provide services to immigrant women? To find out how the institutions are prepared, I asked the interviewees whether they take any trainings or workshops around providing services for immigrant women. Most institutions don't provide any trainings in that area, and staff is not specially trained in providing services for this group. Many of the interviewees emphasized that they by now have experiences working with immigrant women and that they use their own and their colleagues' experiences and knowledge to learn from each other instead of training. Ausa said, we just try to learn from each other. I mean, we all have different kinds of education and different kinds of experiences. It's like this peer training. Similarly, Iris mentions when I asked about how they are preparing in her institution to provide services to people from different backgrounds. It's more like learning by doing, just telling people how it is, like just explain to people that things aren't the same everywhere, so what applies to us doesn't apply all over the world. Similarly to this rather simplistic approach towards letting other staff know that things aren't the same everywhere, Eva shares in the interview, I have a high demand of my staff. I do. There's no prejudice allowed. Of course, we are all different, but it's just like that. After asking about their training, both interviewees hinted at the understanding that staff needs to be told that diversity exists and that everyone needs to be respected. Though Iris later in the interview emphasizes how she believes there is no prejudice. Yes, there is no prejudice among the staff of the institution she works for, as she thinks that the staff have learned to put the prejudice, aside a long time ago. This contradicts what Bryndís shared about the discrimination her clients experienced, and also what several immigrant women share in their Me Too stories. Sharing knowledge and experiences is very valuable, and can be helpful for staff of those institutions, but it cannot replace formalized and structured training addressing a variety of topics. The emphasis on learning from each other further raises the question of who the staff is that works in those institutions. Most interviewees I spoke to were non-immigrant white Icelandic women. Here I should mention how this is a very gendered working field where mostly women work, which is the reason that all my interviewees were women. And I asked them who else works in their institution and how many immigrants work for them. There are a few immigrants employed in the institutions, but the leadership positions are mostly taken up by white non-immigrant Icelandic persons, or how an interviewee put it, the higher you get, the whiter it gets. This means that the people in power to decide about how the services look like, who choose and lead their staff, but also most of the staff themselves are part of the majority population in Iceland. Without training on how to provide services for immigrant women, this seems to lead to a lack of introspection and critical reflection on their own position, but particularly the position of the institutions and how immigrant women might experience them. It furthermore seems to lead to a lack of understanding of structural barriers and discrimination, if not violence, that immigrant women might experience when reaching out for support when experiencing IPV. Only Helga addressed this during the interview after discussing the training options in her institution. I just thought about this need for training because I think the staff has a lot of knowledge. But when I think, where did we get that knowledge from? We kind of got it from ourselves. So I'm sure that in all the research being done now, there will be findings that will tell us that we didn't see it. We are kind of stuck in our own heads. So I think it's extremely important. I haven't thought about that. And it seems when looking at my data and the Me Too stories, that there's a truth about that. So what does this all mean? There are many barriers to support seeking for immigrant women in Iceland. Particularly, the lack of trust is a big barrier. The origins of the lack of trust that the interviewees discuss, like the lack of knowledge, the misconceptions, and the violent Icelandic partner are an issue, and all those points can be found in the Me Too stories as well. However, as I discussed, this is not the whole story, as institutional discrimination, racism, and violence are not discussed, even though we can find them in the stories of the women. The silence around institutional discrimination is connected to the discourse of Icelandic exceptionalism, which says that there is no colonialism or white supremacy within Icelandic culture, and that the Icelandic welfare state is built on equality. Holding on to this discourse leads to a lack of acknowledgement of the positions these institutions have and what they are built on. As mentioned previously, the construction of the normal in Iceland is whiteness due to its history, and that is a position that institutions that provide services for immigrant women need to reflect on in order to decolonize their services. Who exactly are those institutions? Which norms exist within them? Where do those norms come from, and who created them? And to connect this back to my data, remember how Bryndís teaches immigrant women about the real situation. And what seems to miss in this situation is Bryndís reflecting on whose real situation that is, and that maybe what she views as the real situation is influenced by her own position as a white non-immigrant woman, and that this is not the real situation for someone who does not have this position. The interviews indicate that there is a general lack of introspection among institutions in Iceland, or how Helga put it so well, we are kind of stuck in our own heads. The question that results from that, or out of that, is how to address all of this. And I believe that one way is formalized and structured training that addresses various topics around providing services for minoritized groups, as this also does not only seem to be an issue with immigrant women, but also with groups like, for example, disabled women. What should be part of this training is something I cannot fully answer, and I think it's something that needs input from many sides. I believe that critical self-reflection, positionality, and discussions on power relations need to be part of such training, as well as cultural sensitivity. Cultural sensitivity is important, as it prevents that things one knows about something like honor-based violence or a certain group of immigrants becomes a trope and prevents you from seeing other problems that might be a part of whatever that person experiences. Another aspect that would help is to listen to immigrant women's voices, to hear their experiences, and to work with those experiences to change institutional culture instead of putting all the responsibility for change on the immigrant women. These are some suggestions that I have, but I would of course love to hear what you think about this. But I also want to emphasize that training is just one part of the solution, and that decolonizing is an ongoing process, particularly when it's directed at decolonizing institutions. And I would like to thank you for listening, and I would like to thank RANIS, the Icelandic Center for Research, and the Icelandic Equality Fund for funding this project. Thank you.